She walked into Summit Ridge Medical Center with a canvas bag and worn-out sneakers, and within 10 minutes, two surgeons were laughing at her in front of the entire staff. They called her a charity hire. They said she didn't belong in trauma. They handed her a clipboard and pointed her toward the minor cases like she was a medical student on her first rotation. Nobody checked her file. Nobody asked where she'd been. And when the military convoy crashed through the emergency bay doors 3 days later with a dying Marine and a lieutenant general who hadn't slept in 40 hours, that same general looked past every credentialed physician in the hallway and locked eyes with the woman everyone had been ignoring. "Still River," he said. The room went cold. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to my channel and follow along to the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Let's get into it. The drive into Ashford took longer than Dr. Vivian Cross expected. Road construction on Route 9 had backed up traffic for 2 miles, and the detour added 40 minutes through a stretch of mountain highway she didn't recognize from the map. She didn't mind. She'd learned a long time ago that arriving on time to a new place usually just meant more time standing around waiting for someone to tell you where to put your bag. She pulled her truck into the visitor lot. The employee lot pass hadn't been mailed yet, apparently, and sat for a moment looking up at Summit Ridge Medical Center. It was a large facility by Colorado mountain standards, 8 floors of pale stone and glass with a helipad visible on the roof and a trauma bay entrance on the east side marked with orange signage. The kind of hospital that had been expanded too many times, in too many directions, so that it looked assembled rather than designed. She grabbed her canvas bag from the passenger seat, changed her mind, left the coffee cup, locked the truck. The main entrance was cold. Not temperature cold. The heating worked fine, but the kind of cold that comes from a lobby designed to impress visitors rather than welcome staff. High ceilings, a donor wall, a reception desk staffed by a woman who handed Vivian a lanyard without looking up from her screen. The lanyard read Provisional, Trauma Division in block letters, which was technically accurate and also said everything about how her hire had been processed. She found the trauma department on the 3rd floor after one wrong elevator and a short walk through a corridor that smelled like fresh paint and old floor wax. The nursing station was busy, 2 nurses cross-referencing charts, a resident typing at a terminal that kept freezing, a CNA pushing a medication cart that squeaked with every wheel rotation. Nobody acknowledged her immediately, which was also fine. She wasn't expecting a welcome committee. "You must be the new one," said a voice behind her. She turned. A nurse, mid-40s, short dark hair, a lanyard that read Harmon, D, RN, Trauma, was looking her over with the careful, non-committal expression of someone who'd learned to form opinions slowly and revise them quickly. "Vivian Cross," Vivian said. "I was told to report to Dr. Whitmore. He's in the surgical wing. 3rd bay, probably, if he's not in a consult." Nurse Harmon's expression didn't change. "He knows you're coming. Whether he's ready for you is a different question." "Understood," Vivian said. She found the surgical wing without asking twice. Dr. Roland Whitmore was not in the 3rd bay. He was in the corridor outside it, standing with another physician she didn't yet know, reviewing something on a tablet with the focused, performative attention of a man who was aware he had an audience. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore his lab coat the way some men wore expensive suits, with the specific intention of being noticed. The other physician was younger, darker-haired, with the angular face and barely suppressed irritation of someone who'd been told to wait on something and was choosing not to show how much it bothered him. His badge read Dr. Felix Nard, Chief Surgical Resident. Vivian approached. "Dr. Whitmore, I'm Dr. Cross, reporting for the Trauma Division transfer." Whitmore looked up from the tablet slowly. Not because he was finishing a thought, she could tell the tablet was showing a supply order, nothing urgent, but because he wanted her to register the delay. He looked her over the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that's been placed in the wrong room. "Cross," he said. "Right." He handed the tablet to Nard without looking at him. "You came from... where was it?" "Most recently, Fort Delaware Regional. Before that, Cascade Valley." "Mountain facilities," Nard said, not looking at her. "So, rural. Combat adjacent, technically. Fort Delaware is a military installation hospital." Whitmore smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "We run a very different operation here. Summit Ridge handles trauma volume that most military-adjacent facilities wouldn't see in a year. I want to make sure you understand that before we discuss your role. Of course, Vivian said. We'll start you with triage screening, minor and intermediate cases while you get oriented to our protocols. He glanced at Nard. Felix will walk you through the intake system. Nard looked at her for the first time. His expression didn't communicate welcome. It communicated tolerance, the kind given to someone who technically belongs somewhere but hasn't earned the right to take up space. "Follow me," he said. She followed. It took approximately 40 minutes in Nard's company to understand the basic geometry of the situation. He walked her through the intake system with the speed and enthusiasm of someone fulfilling a legal obligation, answering questions in the minimum syllables possible, and twice interrupted her to answer his pager even when the page was non-urgent. He called her the transfer to a nurse within earshot. He explained the surgical hierarchy with just enough emphasis on the word senior to make sure she understood where she sat in it. She took notes. She asked the right questions. She didn't react to any of it. By the end of the first afternoon, she had been assigned a locker, issued a code for the staff bathroom, and positioned at a triage desk that hadn't been used as a primary station in what looked like several weeks. The chair was slightly broken. She adjusted and sat down and pulled the first chart. The first 3 days were quiet in the sense that nothing exploded, but there was a current of tension running beneath every shift that Vivian felt and cataloged without comment. Whitmore and Nard ran the trauma floor like a joint operation. Whitmore setting policy, Nard enforcing it, both of them operating with the comfortable confidence of men who hadn't been meaningfully challenged in years. The nursing staff had divided itself into two distinct camps, those who'd adapted to the culture and those who were quietly surviving it. Nurse Harmon fell into neither category exactly. She did her job with a precision that suggested she'd decided long ago that the politics weren't worth her energy, but that patient care absolutely was. On Vivian's second afternoon, she flagged a chart on a 43-year-old man named Gail Orvant, who'd been brought in after a highway accident. He'd been triaged, treated for a shoulder laceration and possible concussion, and was being prepped for discharge. Vivian had reviewed the imaging. She found the attending, a third-year resident named Priya Saul, in the corridor. His CT shows a shadow in the splenic region, Vivian said. I want to hold him. Saul looked at her carefully. Dr. Nard cleared him. I know. I'd like Dr. Nard to look at this image again. He's in a consult. Then I'll wait. Saul hesitated, then nodded slowly and went to find him. Nard appeared 8 minutes later with the energy of someone who'd been interrupted during something he considered important. He looked at the image on Vivian's screen. His jaw tightened. The spleen is intact, he said. The spleen is intact. But look at this. She traced a line on the monitor. The shadow here, behind the organ. That's not artifact. There's bleeding. You're reading minor vascular as hemorrhage. I'm reading internal bleeding as internal bleeding, she said. Her voice was even. I've seen this pattern before, in field conditions where imaging equipment was worse than this, and we still caught it. Nard held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the screen. Something in his face shifted. Not agreement, not apology, just a recalculation happening somewhere behind his eyes. Fine. Keep him for observation. 4 hours. He walked away without another word. 4 hours later, Gail Orvant went into emergency surgery for a delayed splenic rupture. He survived. His wife cried in the family waiting area and grabbed Nurse Harmon's hand and said thank you 6 times in a row. Harmon squeezed back and didn't say anything. When she walked back past the triage desk, she slowed and looked at Vivian and gave a small, decisive nod. It meant something, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it out loud. The next morning, Whitmore pulled her aside before rounds. He told her the Orvant case had been reviewed, that her catch had been noted, and that going forward she should route any imaging concerns through the appropriate chain rather than approaching residents directly. She said she understood. He walked away looking satisfied. Nard didn't mention it at all. By day 4, she was eating lunch alone in the break room with a half-finished report and a cup of coffee that had gone cold when she heard Whitmore and Nard in the corridor outside. She wasn't trying to listen. The acoustics were what they were. Just another mid-level trauma doc who thinks combat experience translates, Nard was saying. She's probably used to field medicine where the standard is keep them alive until you can get them somewhere real. She flagged the Orvant bleed, another voice said. one she didn't recognize. That was a real catch. Lucky Red, Whitmore said. The shadow was ambiguous. Any senior attending would have held him to with a full review. We just didn't have bandwidth that morning. Cross isn't doing anything that demonstrates actual surgical capability. She's doing triage. A pause, and then, she doesn't belong in trauma leadership. Not here. Let her run the minor cases. Keep the board clear. That's what she's useful for. Vivian put down her coffee cup. The ceramic made a quiet sound on the table. She picked up her report and went back to work. That afternoon, she ran 4 triage cases, caught a missed fractured rib on a patient who'd been waved through, and correctly identified early septic signs in a 61-year-old woman who had been waiting 2 hours in the observation room with a chart that marked her as stable. She ordered cultures, started broad-spectrum antibiotics, and upgraded the patient's status before anyone else had reviewed the morning labs. By the time the attending arrived, the woman's blood pressure had already begun to stabilize. No one acknowledged either catch. On the morning of day 5, a Thursday, cold, with cloud cover that had turned the mountains gray and the parking lot dark, a call came in on the trauma line at 7:42 a.m. Military convoy, Route 7 approach, multiple casualties, ETA 11 minutes. The trauma bay activated fast. Whitmore appeared from the surgical wing, Nard behind him, 2 residents scrambling to prep stations. Vivian moved toward the bay entrance out of instinct and Nard stepped into her path, not aggressively, but deliberately. "We have it covered," he said. "You're on triage overflow." "How many inbound?" 3 confirmed, possibly 4. Military, so there will be medical officers with them. You'll be more useful managing the board. She looked at him. He met her eyes without blinking. It wasn't a suggestion. She went to the board. The convoy arrived at 7:53 a.m. She heard it before she saw it. The specific sound of heavy military vehicles, different from civilian ambulances, deeper and more deliberate. Through the trauma bay window, she saw 2 armored transport vehicles and a black SUV pulling into the emergency lane. The back doors of the second transport opened and a military medical team poured out, stretchers moving, voices tight and clipped in the way she recognized from places she didn't think about on ordinary days. 3 Marines, 2 walking wounded with visible extremity injuries. 1 on a stretcher. The one on the stretcher was the problem. Even from 30 feet away, across a glass window and through the organized chaos of the bay entrance, she could read the posture of the military medic at the head of the stretcher, the jaw, the speed, the particular way the hands were positioned on the patient that meant they were trying to hold something together that was coming apart. She'd stood in that exact posture herself. She knew what it cost to maintain it. The black SUV doors opened. A man stepped out who was not moving with urgency. He was moving with command. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, in full-dress uniform. Not the uniform of a man who'd just arrived from a field operation, but of one who'd come from somewhere formal and changed the moment the call came in. His decorations were visible from where she stood. 3 rows minimum. A lieutenant general's stars on his collar. He didn't look at Whitmore, who had walked out to meet the convoy with his hand extended and his most practiced, confident expression in place. He looked through the window. He looked at her. Vivian went still. The general said something to the aide beside him. The aide moved toward the trauma bay doors. Whitmore was still talking. She could see his mouth moving, his posture shifting into the particular register of a physician who expected deference and was recalibrating. The general wasn't responding to him. He was still looking through the glass. She didn't move. The doors opened. The aide stepped in. "Ma'am, the general requests the physician he identified, Dr. Vivian Cross." 3 people in triage overflow turned to look at her. She set down the chart she was holding. Whitmore's voice came through the open doors, louder than it needed to be. "I'm Dr. Whitmore, Chief of Surgical Services. I'll be overseeing all treatment for your personnel." "Dr. Cross," the aide repeated, and his voice wasn't on negotiating. She walked through the doors. The general was standing at the entrance to the trauma bay, and up close the weight he was carrying was visible. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from watching someone you're responsible for getting hurt. He was holding his composure the way she'd seen officers hold it when everything was going badly, and they couldn't afford to let it show, which meant underneath the discipline there was something much more human and much more afraid. He looked at her for a long moment. "Still River," he said. Her chest tightened. The call sign she hadn't heard in 3 years landed in the corridor of Summit Ridge Medical Center like a round fired into a wall. Sudden, irreversible, changing the shape of everything around it. "General Karras," she said. "I need you in that bay," he said. "Right now." He's got maybe 30 minutes before the vascular damage becomes irreversible. Whitmore had stepped in behind her. "General, with respect, I am the senior physician on this floor, and our trauma protocol requires—" "I'm not asking about protocol," General Marcus Karras said, and his voice dropped in a way that Vivian recognized. The particular register of someone who held enough rank that they'd stop needing to raise their voice to stop a room. "I'm telling you what I need, Dr. Cross. In that bay. Now." The corridor went quiet. Nard was somewhere behind her. She heard him shift his weight. A nurse near the station had stopped moving entirely. Karras held the door open and looked at her, not at Whitmore, not at any of them. And in the space between one breath and the next, the question in his eyes was not about rank or protocol or hospital politics. It was the same question she'd answered in worse places than this. "Can you hold this?" She walked past Whitmore into the trauma bay. The Marine on the table was young, mid-20s maybe, though the pale, blood-drained face made it hard to read age accurately. His name, she'd learn in the next 30 seconds from the medic's verbal report, was Sergeant First Class Dante Reeves. The injury was a deep penetrating wound to the inner thigh that had compromised the femoral vascular structure. The field medics had been working to stabilize blood loss for 40 minutes in transit. He'd received 2 units on the road. It wasn't enough. "Status," she said, and her voice came out in the register she hadn't used in 3 years. Flat, fast, no space in it for anything except what was necessary. The military medic, a staff sergeant, looked at her and immediately began his report. Femoral sheath involvement. Possible arterial nick. 2 units whole blood in transit. BP dropped twice in the last 20 minutes. Last reading 76/40. GCS is 10. Imaging? Field ultrasound only. No CT. She was already moving, gloves on, hands at the wound site, reading through the dressing without removing it entirely because removing it would cost time she didn't have. She could feel the pressure differential through the gauze. She could feel the warmth pattern. She'd done this in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a research hospital. "I need vascular surgery ready in OR2, she said. "I need 6 units O-negative, 2 of FFP, a thoracic tray pulled even if we don't use it. I need the best vascular tech you have in this building at that table in the next 5 minutes. Someone behind her said, "Dr. Whitmore hasn't cleared. Is there a vascular tech in this building?" she said. "Yes." "Then get them." She looked at Dante Reeves. His eyelids were half open. His breathing was shallow but present. Young, strong, the kind of physiological reserves you only see in special operations soldiers who've been trained until their body's baseline is something a civilian doctor would call exceptional. "Stay with me, Sergeant," she said. He moved his eyes toward her. His lips barely opened. "Doctor," he said, and the word cost him. "Yeah," she said. "Still here. You're not going anywhere." Behind her, she heard General Karras say, quietly, with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent decades making irreversible decisions, "Somebody get this man's surgeon what she needs, right now." And for the first time since she'd walked into Summit Ridge Medical Center, the room moved the way rooms were supposed to move when something real was happening. Fast, without argument, without anyone stopping to check the hierarchy. Whitmore stepped back. Nard stepped back. The nurses moved. The tech appeared. The OR doors opened. Vivian moved with the stretcher, never losing contact with the patient, her mind already running the procedure sequence, the entry point, the repair approach, the contingency. If the arterial damage was worse than the field assessment suggested, she'd done harder things in less time with worse equipment. She didn't think about the hallway she'd just walked through. She didn't think about the triage desk or the broken chair or the word useful said in a corridor when someone thought she wasn't listening. She thought about Dante Reeves's femoral artery and the 30 minutes she'd just been handed and what she was going to do with every second of it. The OR doors swung closed behind her. The lights in OR2 were the same temperature as every operating room she'd ever worked in. That specific shadowless white that flattened everything and made the world outside the table irrelevant. She'd worked under worse. Generators and forward operating bases that flickered during artillery. headlamps duct taped to helmet brackets. Once, a vehicle bay with 2 flashlights and a medic holding a third in his teeth. Summit Ridge's OR2 was, by any objective measure, excellent. She registered that and moved on. The vascular tech's name was Osei. She caught it on his badge as he set the tray. It was fast and quiet, and arranged the instruments in the sequence she would have chosen herself, which meant either he'd been briefed or he was good enough to read a room. Either way, she didn't have to redirect him, and that alone saved 40 seconds. The anesthesiologist, a compact woman named Dr. Lyra Vance, had Dante Reeves sedated and intubated by the time Vivian made her first assessment cut. Vance worked with a focused, contained economy. No excess commentary, no nervous questions. And Vivian noted that too, filed it. Arterial? Vance asked, not looking up from her panel. Looking now. Vivian traced the damage with practiced care. The femoral sheath had taken a deep penetrating injury. She could see immediately that the field assessment had been close but not complete. The arterial wall was compromised at a section the mobile ultrasound would have struggled to fully characterize. Not a clean nick. A partial tear, progressive, held together partly by the body's own clotting response, and partly by the pressure dressing the field medic had applied with what had clearly been significant skill. If they'd been 10 minutes slower getting him in, the dressing would have failed. Partial arterial tear, proximal third. The sheath took the worst of it. I'm going to need the 6-neuroproline, and I want suction on the left, not right-left. Keep it out of my sight line. Osei adjusted without comment. She worked. The first 40 minutes were the kind that don't allow for anything outside the immediate geometry of the problem. Tissue, blood flow, repair sequence. The specific tension required to suture vascular tissue without constricting it. Her hands did what they'd been trained to do across 15 years and 2 combat deployments and more field surgeries than she'd formally documented, because there hadn't always been paperwork available, or time, or a chain of command that cared about paperwork when people were bleeding out. She didn't narrate what she was doing. She didn't explain herself. She just worked. Vance kept the sedation steady and called vitals at intervals, her voice calm and informational, and Vivian answered when an answer was needed and stayed silent when it wasn't. 43 minutes in, the repair held on first pressure test. She released a breath she'd been holding somewhere below conscious awareness. How's his pressure? Coming up, Vance said. 89/52 and climbing. Good. She looked at the field. Osei, I need the irrigation running before I close. And tell whoever's outside that we're going to be in here at least another hour. Who do I tell? Osei asked. Whoever's most worried, she said. She knew without being told that General Karras was somewhere outside those doors. She'd seen the set of his shoulders before the OR swung closed. She'd seen that posture on other generals, other commanders, waiting outside other surgical spaces in other countries while she worked on their people. There was a specific quality to the waiting of men like that. Contained but not calm, controlled but coiled, the kind of stillness that was actually a form of sustained effort. She'd never found a way to make it easier for them and had stopped trying. The only thing that helped was results. She focused on the closing. Dante Reeves's femoral artery held. The vascular repair was clean, not elegant, because there was no such thing as elegant in vascular trauma surgery, only degrees of successful and degrees of failure, but structurally sound, the kind of repair that would hold through recovery and rehabilitation, and if Reeves wanted it, a return to operational capacity. She didn't know his plans. That wasn't her business. Her business was making sure he had the option. 2 hours and 11 minutes after the OR doors swung shut, Vivian Cross stepped out of OR2. She pulled her gloves off in the corridor and dropped them in the waste receptacle and looked up. General Karras was standing 12 feet away. He hadn't sat down. He was still in full dress uniform. She'd half expected him to have changed into something less formal, but he hadn't, which told her something about how he'd processed the last 2 hours. An aide stood 3 feet behind him at a slight angle, and 2 of the general's staff were at the far end of the corridor. But Karras himself had clearly told them to stay back, because the 12 feet of space between him and the OR doors was empty. He looked at her face first, reading her expression the way combat officers learned to read a medic's face, not for what they said, but for what they were allowing themselves to show. She let him see it. He's stable, she said. Vascular repair held. He's going to recovery with circulation intact in the leg. If rehab goes the way it should, he'll have full function. Karras said nothing for a moment. His jaw moved once, tightly, and then he nodded. Just one nod, deliberate and compressed. In another man, it might have looked minimal. She knew what it cost. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady and quiet, and meant it in a way that thank you from most people did not. "He's strong," she said. That helped. "He is." Karras's eyes moved past her briefly to the OR doors, then back. "You haven't changed. You have. More stars." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but as close as she'd seen from him, and it didn't surprise her that it looked like that. Small, dry, the expression of a man who'd kept his sense of humor somewhere very well protected. "Still economical," he said. "Still practical," she said. He held her gaze, and something passed between them that wasn't a conversation, more like a mutual acknowledgement of a history that neither of them was going to summarize out loud, because it couldn't be summarized, because it was the kind of history that lived in the hands and the reflexes and the specific way you read a room when everything in it is going wrong. Then footsteps behind her, and the weight of the moment shifted. Dr. Roland Whitmore appeared from the corridor junction, and he was not alone. Nard was 2 steps behind him. A hospital administrator Vivian had seen twice in passing, a thin man in his 50s named Hollis, whose office was on the 4th floor and who carried the specific energy of someone whose job was to make problems disappear before they became expensive, was behind Nard. The 3 of them approaching in a cluster had the feeling of a formation, though not a military one. More like a management review arriving at the scene of a decision it hadn't approved. Whitmore addressed Karras directly, bypassing Vivian. "General, I'm glad to hear the surgery was successful. I want to assure you that Summit Ridge's full resources are available for your soldiers' recovery. I've arranged—" "How long has Dr. Cross been on staff here?" Karras asked. Whitmore stopped. "I'm sorry." 5 days, Vivian said. Karras nodded slowly, and his eyes moved to Whitmore with the particular quality of attention that senior officers developed. Not hostile, but measuring. The kind of look that evaluated and filed and did not forget. "And in 5 days, what has she been assigned to?" Whitmore's expression managed its own composure. "Dr. Cross is in an orientation period. We have a structured—" "She was running triage overflow," Karras said, "when my aide found her. Standard procedure for new staff, regardless of—" "General." Nard's voice came from behind Whitmore, careful and practiced in the way Vivian had heard him manage physicians he didn't outrank. "I want to be transparent. Dr. Cross's credentials are strong, but our trauma protocol requires an evaluation period for all incoming physicians. The assignment wasn't a reflection of capability, it was—" "Dr. Nard." Karras's voice carried no particular heat. That was somehow worse than if it had. "I'm familiar with Dr. Cross's credentials. I've read her service record. I was present for approximately 1/3 of what's in it. What I'm trying to understand is how a trauma physician with her background ended up reviewing triage paperwork while a Marine with a vascular injury sat in a bay." The corridor was quiet. Nurse Harmon had appeared at the junction, chart in hand, and had made the invisible calculation that experienced nurses make, whether to retreat or to occupy space at a sufficient distance that she could honestly claim she was simply passing through. She chose the latter. She stood at the junction with her chart, and she did not leave. Whitmore recovered himself. "With respect, General, staffing decisions are internal. I'm not asking you to justify them," Karras said. "I'm noting them." He looked at Hollis, the administrator, who had not yet spoken, and who seemed to have developed a strong interest in the middle distance. "Whoever oversees medical staffing at this hospital, I would appreciate a conversation at their convenience." The word convenience was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and everyone present heard it. Hollis said, "Of course, General. I'll arrange that." Karras looked at Vivian once more. "I'll want to be briefed on Sergeant Reeves's recovery progress." "I'll make sure you have updates," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else to Whitmore or Nard. He turned and walked back toward his aide and the 2 staff members at the end of the corridor, and the absence of any farewell to the hospital's senior physicians was itself a form of communication so clear that it didn't require translation. Whitmore waited until Karras was out of earshot. Then he turned to Vivian, and his composure was intact, but something behind it had shifted, tightened, recalculated. She'd seen the same recalibration in other people who just discovered that the ground under their assumptions was less solid than they'd built on. "Your OR performance was appropriate," he said. "We'll debrief the case." "Of course," she said. "I'd also like to review your credentialing file. There may be items that weren't fully processed during your transfer paperwork." He said it as a neutral administrative statement. She heard what it was: a reach for an angle, something to examine, a way to reassert a structural position over someone who had just made him look small in a corridor in front of a general and an administrator. "I'll make myself available," she said. Nard said nothing. He'd been silent since Karis's attention had moved over him, and the silence had a quality to it. Not chastened exactly, but recalibrating. She'd worked with enough people like Nard to know that type didn't change fast. They bent under direct pressure and returned to their shape when the pressure moved. The question was what they did while they were bending. She went to the staff lounge. She washed her hands again, even though she'd already washed them twice. She sat with a cup of coffee and let her pulse come down. Nurse Harmon came in 10 minutes later, poured herself a cup, and sat down at the opposite end of the table. She didn't immediately say anything. Then, "Reeves is in recovery. His color is already better than when they brought him in." "Good," Vivian said. Lyra Vance told the recovery nurses that was some of the cleanest vascular work she'd seen. "I'm not telling you that for your ego. I'm telling you so you know what people are actually saying." Vivian looked at her coffee cup. "I appreciate it." Harmon turned her cup in a slow circle. "Whitmore called Hollis before the surgery was done. I overheard the call. I wasn't trying to. The walls in the East Corridor are what they are. He was trying to get ahead of the general's presence, positioning it as routine, saying the military liaison contact had been handled, and that the surgery outcome reflected the hospital's standard of care." Vivian looked up. "He wasn't going to mention you by name," Harmon said. "In the version he was building for Hollis, the successful surgery was going to be Summit Ridge's success, not yours." She held that for a moment. It didn't surprise her. It also didn't exactly make her angry. Not yet. Not in a way that was useful. What it did was sharpen her attention to what was actually in motion around her. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Harmon stood. "Just watch your back. Whitmore doesn't do things obviously, and Nard does what Whitmore tells him to do, which means he's not done with you either." She left. Vivian sat with the cooling coffee and thought about what watching her back looked like in a hospital, which was different from what it looked like in the places she'd done it before. In the field, it was physical and directional. You knew the angles, you knew the terrain, you built your awareness around what was literal and spatial. Here, it was institutional. It came in the form of credentialing reviews and case debrief meetings, and the quiet rerouting of information through the right channels to the right ears at the right time. It came in the form of a phone call made before the surgery was done. She'd survived the first kind. She was less practiced at the second, but she was not without resources. When she left the lounge, she walked to recovery first. She checked Dante Reeves's chart herself, reviewed the vitals, confirmed the circulation checks the nurses were running on the leg. He was deeply sedated, which was correct. They'd keep him down for several hours. But his color was, as Harmon had said, already improving, the gray gone out of his face, and the shallow quality of his breathing settling into something more even. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment and looked at the monitor readings. She'd done her part. The rest was time and the body's own work. She was at the nursing station reviewing the recovery protocol she'd left with Vance when the first alert came through. Not a trauma alert. Those had a specific tone she'd already memorized. This was an administrative system notification routed to her provisional staff email, which she pulled up on the station terminal because her phone hadn't been fully integrated into the hospital system yet. It was from the credentialing office. Flagged urgent. It read, "Per review of transfer documentation, certain certifications in Dr. V. Cross's file require re-verification. Pending completion of re-verification process, authorization to perform surgical procedures has been temporarily suspended. This action is not disciplinary in nature. Please contact the credentialing office at your earliest convenience." She read it twice. The timestamp was 41 minutes ago. While she'd been in OR2, closing an arterial repair on a Marine who was alive right now because of what her suspended certification had allowed her to do, someone had processed this notification. She looked at the station clock. 2:14 p.m. The credentialing office closed at 4:30. She printed the notice, folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and walked to the elevator. The credentialing office was on the second floor, through a set of frosted glass doors, and down a short corridor where the carpet was a different, older pattern than the rest of that wing. The woman at the front desk was in her 40s, professional, and absorbed in something on her screen that she minimized quickly when Vivian appeared. "I received a suspension notice," Vivian said. "I'd like to understand the basis for it." The woman, her nameplate read Greta Osei, and Vivian filed the possible relation to the vascular tech without comment, looked at her screen. "Let me pull your file." She typed. She read. Something in her expression went carefully neutral, in the way that people went neutral when they'd been told a thing, and were trying to decide how much of it they'd been given to own. "The flag was entered this morning. It indicates that 2 of your surgical certifications, the vascular trauma extension and the advanced field surgical certification, haven't been formally verified through our state board cross-referencing system." "Those certifications are current," Vivian said. "I can produce documentation." "The issue isn't currency. The issue is that the verification wasn't completed through our standard intake process. There's a gap in the paperwork chain." "Who flagged it?" A pause. "The request came through the Chief of Surgical Services office." Whitmore. "What's the timeline for re-verification?" she asked. "Standard process is 7 to 14 business days. And in the meantime?" "You'd be limited to non-surgical functions, triage assessment, consult, chart review." Vivian looked at her evenly. "The surgery I just completed on a military special operations soldier, that's now flagged as having been performed under a suspended authorization?" Greta Osei's jaw tightened slightly. She was clearly not the architect of this situation, and was clearly unhappy about being its face. "The flag is dated this morning. The surgery would have been," she checked the screen, "initiated at approximately 8:30 a.m. The suspension notice is time-stamped 9:47 a.m. There's an argument that the surgery was authorized at initiation." "There's an argument," Vivian repeated, "or there's a fact. The office will review the sequence, but until re-verification is complete, the scope restriction stands." Vivian nodded once. She picked up the copy of the notice she'd set on the desk. "I'll need a formal written explanation of what documentation will satisfy re-verification." "I can have that ready by tomorrow morning. I'll wait," Vivian said. Greta Osei looked at her. Then she turned to her screen and began typing. 20 minutes later, Vivian walked out of the credentialing office with a printed list of re-verification requirements and a set of timestamps she'd asked Greta to provide, every action taken on her file in the past 24 hours, each with the user ID attached. Greta had provided them without argument, which suggested she had already made some private assessment of how this situation was going to land. In the elevator, Vivian looked at the user IDs. She was not an IT specialist, and the codes were opaque to her in their specific meaning, but there were 3 separate actions on her file, all clustered between 9:20 a.m. and 9:47 a.m. While Dante Reeves's femoral artery was being repaired in OR2, someone had been moving through her paperwork. She had 24 hours before the business day reset and the re-verification clock formally started. She had a general who was owed a briefing on his sergeant's recovery progress, a nurse who had just given her the most useful intelligence she'd received in 5 days, and a credential suspension that had been engineered to remove her from surgical practice before anyone could decide she was supposed to be there. She also had the direct contact number for the military liaison office that had been stapled to Karis's aide's intake form, which she'd read while standing at the trauma bay entrance and retained because she'd always had the kind of memory that held information she might need later, even when the situation didn't look like it was going to require it. She was still standing in the elevator when her phone buzzed. "Unknown number, Colorado area code," she answered. "Dr. Cross?" The voice was male, organized, not the general and not the aide she'd spoken to earlier. "My name is Major Darren Quill, JAG Corps. I'm currently coordinating with General Karis's office regarding the medical care provided to Sergeant Reeves today. I understand there may be some administrative issues at the facility level." She stood very still in the elevator as the doors opened on the 3rd floor, and she did not get out. "You've been informed quickly," she said. "The General's office monitors any situation involving his personnel, particularly when the care outcome is significant." A brief pause. "Dr. Cross, I want to be direct with you. We're aware of the certification flag on your file. We're also aware of the timing. I'm not going to make any claims about intent at this stage, but I want you to know that the JAG office is prepared to provide formal documentation supporting your credentials and your service record, and that documentation is going to be very difficult to argue with. The elevator doors closed again and she was back in the shaft going nowhere. What does that mean for the re-verification process? She asked. It means, Quill said carefully, that whoever initiated this process may have miscalculated the resources you have access to. And I'd suggest that when you go back to that credentialing office tomorrow, you bring everything we're going to send you tonight. She exhaled. And the general? The general knows what you did today. He hasn't forgotten anything from before. And he is not the kind of man who does nothing when someone who saved his people is being managed out of a hospital. The elevator doors opened again on the third floor, and this time she stepped out. Send me what you have, she said. Check your email at 7 a.m., Quill said. And Dr. Cross? Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a longer day than today was. He ended the call. She stood in the third-floor corridor of Summit Ridge Medical Center in the late afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the hall, and for a moment she let herself feel the weight of the day. Not its victories, not its indignities, not the specific quality of General Karras's voice when he'd said "Still River" in a hallway full of people who had no idea what it meant. Just the weight of it. The whole dense, complicated human weight of a day that had started with a broken chair and a cup of cold coffee. Then she heard her name, sharp, tight, from the direction of the nursing station. It was Nurse Harmon, and she wasn't walking toward Vivian. She was at the station, receiver in hand, and her face had the specific compressed focus that Vivian had already learned to read on her. Cross, Harmon said again. Recovery is calling. Reeves's leg. The distal pulse. Vivian was already moving before Harmon finished the sentence. The recovery ward was 40 seconds from the nursing station at a walk and 12 at a run, and Vivian ran. The recovery nurse, a young man named Taft, whose hands were already on the patient when Vivian pushed through the door, looked up with the controlled expression of someone trying hard not to show how alarmed they were. Distal pulse dropped off on the left foot about 6 minutes ago, he said. I ran the check twice. It's there, but it's weak. Weaker than the last reading. Vivian was already at the foot of the bed, 2 fingers on Reeves's dorsalis pedis. She found the pulse. Faint. Irregular in its pressure rather than its rhythm, which told her something specific. She moved to the posterior tibial. Same pattern. Present but diminished. The kind of reading that sat in the margin between acceptable and not acceptable, and required you to make a call about which side of that margin it was on. When did you last do a full limb assessment? She asked. 40 minutes ago. Everything was strong. 40 minutes. That was fast for this kind of change, which narrowed the differential. She lifted the blanket and looked at the leg itself. Color, temperature, the visible vascular map beneath the skin. There was subtle mottling beginning at the ankle. Not dramatic yet, but present. Get me a portable Doppler, she said, and page Lyra Vance. Taft moved. Vivian stayed at the bedside, running through the sequence in her mind. The repair had held on pressure test in the OR. 2 hours and 11 minutes of solid work, clean closure, no indication of residual bleeding when she'd left the field. Which meant if there was vascular compromise now, it was either the repair site showing late stress or, and this was the possibility she was holding carefully because it changed the intervention. There was a secondary issue she hadn't had imaging to identify during the emergency procedure. The Doppler arrived. She ran it herself, moving methodically from proximal to distal, listening to the waveform character rather than just its presence. What she heard confirmed what she'd felt with her fingers. The flow was there, but the waveform was monophasic, where it should have been biphasic or triphasic. The specific auditory signature of downstream resistance, of something impeding flow without fully blocking it. What are we looking at? Vance's voice from the door. She'd come fast. Possible vasospasm or early compartment pressure, Vivian said. I want compartment pressure readings on all 4 compartments before I make a decision. He's only 3 hours post-repair. I know. Vance came to stand beside her. She looked at the Doppler readings, then at the leg, and her expression did what experienced anesthesiologists' expressions did. Assessed, filed, prepared for multiple outcomes simultaneously. If it's compartment syndrome this early, that's fast progression. Combat injuries present differently, Vivian said. The blast and compression forces he took before we got him, that tissue was already stressed, the surgical trauma layered on top of it. She looked at Reeves's face. Still deeply sedated, still breathing evenly on the ventilator they'd keep him on through recovery, which meant the pain signal that would have alerted a conscious patient wasn't available. We don't have the luxury of watching and waiting. Get me the pressure monitor. The compartment pressure readings took 9 minutes to complete. The anterior compartment came in at 31 millimeters of mercury. The deep posterior came in at 34. Both were elevated. Neither was yet at the threshold that made fasciotomy a clear-cut decision. That threshold was generally accepted at 30 to within 30 of diastolic pressure. But Reeves's diastolic was running low post-surgery, which compressed the window considerably, and the trajectory of the numbers combined with the Doppler findings was not a trajectory she was willing to watch extend. She was going to have to take him back. OR2 again, she said. Fasciotomy. I want it set up in the next 15 minutes. Taft was already reaching for the phone. Vance said, Your surgical authorization is suspended. The room went quiet. Taft stopped moving. Vivian looked at Vance. Vance looked back at her with the expression of someone who was stating a fact they actively disliked, because she was a physician and she understood exactly what the fact meant in this context and what it was going to require. I know, Vivian said. Whitmore is the senior authorized surgeon on trauma tonight. I know that too. Do you want me to... Page Whitmore, Vivian said. Right now. Tell him I need him in recovery immediately for an urgent consult on the post-op marine. She was already moving toward the door. And tell him to bring his surgical kit. She found a phone at the nursing station and called the number Quill had given her at the end of the call. Not Quill directly, because it was after hours, but the duty line he'd mentioned as a backup. She explained the situation in 40 seconds. The duty officer on the other end was efficient and asked 2 clarifying questions and told her to hold. She held for 90 seconds. The duty officer came back. General Karras is still in the building. He's been in a meeting with hospital administration. I'll reach him directly. Tell him it's about Reeves, she said. Tell him the word is compartment. She hung up and went back to recovery. Whitmore arrived 4 minutes later. He was still in his street clothes under his lab coat, which meant he'd been somewhere in the building but not on the floor, and his expression when he walked in carried the layer of irritation that people carried when they were called back to a situation they'd thought was concluded. He looked at Reeves, looked at the Doppler unit, looked at the pressure readings Taft had written on the board, and then looked at Vivian with an expression she couldn't fully read. Assessment, calculation, and something that might have been, under very controlled conditions, concern. Walk me through it, he said. She did. She gave him the clinical summary without editorializing, pulse character, compartment readings, timeline, the Doppler waveform findings, her interpretation of why the progression was faster than standard presentation. She gave it to him the way she'd brief a surgeon, not the way she'd argue a point, because right now the only thing that mattered was Reeves's leg, and she wasn't going to waste 15 seconds on anything else. Whitmore listened. He ran his own assessment. She stepped back and let him, watched his hands move over the limb, watched him run the Doppler himself, watched his face. He was a competent physician. She'd never questioned that. Whatever else he was, he knew how to read a clinical picture. He straightened up. Fasciotomy, he said. You're right. I know. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a complex calculation she couldn't fully access, the kind that happened when a person was simultaneously processing a medical reality, a political situation, and a personal one, all at once, and trying to find the path through them that cost the least. She'd seen that calculation before, in different people, in different circumstances, and she'd learned that you couldn't predict reliably what came out of it. I need you in that OR, he said. She looked at him. You did the original repair, he said, and his voice was controlled and clinical. You know the anatomy of this specific field. I need that. He paused. I'll authorize your participation under my oversight. The credentialing restriction allows consultative surgical presence when the authorizing surgeon approves it. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of anything beyond the immediate medical need. She understood that, and she understood that pressing for more right now would cost Reeves minutes he didn't have. Then let's go, she said. OR2 had been reset since the morning, everything clean and repositioned, and the scrub tech who'd come in on the emergency call. Not Ose this time, a woman named Price, who moved with the same quiet efficiency, had the fasciotomy set up ready in 13 minutes, which was fast, and Vivian told her so, because Price's hands had been moving without hesitation, and that deserved to be said. Whitmore scrubbed in beside her at the sink. He was quiet. She was quiet. The water ran and they both looked at the wall above the scrub sink and didn't talk, which was fine. She didn't need him to talk. She needed him to be a good surgeon for the next 90 minutes, and she thought, watching his hands under the water, that he probably would be. The fasciotomy on a post-traumatic compartment syndrome was not the same kind of surgery as the arterial repair had been. It was in some ways more straightforward. 4 compartment releases, skin and fascia divided to allow the compressed muscle tissue to expand and restore blood flow. But straightforward did not mean simple, and in a post-operative field where the tissue planes had already been altered by the earlier repair, there were angles and approaches that required precise knowledge of what had already been done and why. She guided Whitmore through those angles. She didn't take instruments out of his hands. She told him what she'd seen in the original field, where she'd placed the repair, how the fascial architecture had presented during the initial surgery, and he used that information with the competence she'd assessed and did the work accurately, and without the kind of ego-driven resistance she might have expected from a man in his position who had reason to resent being guided. 40 minutes in, blood flow to the distal leg was visibly improving. The Doppler signal strengthened in real time, shifting from monophasic toward biphasic, and when Taft, who'd come in to assist, called out the change in the reading, the OR exhaled collectively, the specific kind of exhale that happened when a room full of people who'd been holding tension they couldn't fully acknowledge let go of a fraction of it. "He's getting perfusion back," Vance said from her panel. "Keep watching it," Vivian said. She stood at Whitmore's shoulder for the next 50 minutes, reading the field, answering his questions when he asked them, staying silent when he didn't, and thinking intermittently about the fact that this was the second time in one day she'd been in this OR keeping Dante Reeves from a permanent disability that had been advancing toward him like a slow, quiet tide. The first time she'd been in command of the room. This time, she was standing 2 inches to the surgeon's left with a suspended authorization and an institutional situation that was actively being used against her. And it was still her knowledge in Whitmore's hands, still her assessment driving the decision to open this room tonight, still her read of a distal pulse that had caught the problem before it became irreversible. The work was the work. The rest of it was going to have to wait. Whitmore closed the fasciotomy sites with the wound packed open. Standard for this procedure, the skin would be closed in stages over the following days as the swelling resolved, and stepped back from the table, and when he looked at Vivian, there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not contrition. Not quite that. More like the expression of a man who had been operating under one set of assumptions and had just run them against a reality that didn't fit and hadn't yet decided what to do about the gap. "Good catch," he said. "Good surgery," she said, because that was also true, and because she wasn't going to be small about it. He nodded once and left the OR. She stayed to review the closing dressing with Price and confirm the post-op monitoring protocol with Vance, and when she finally walked out of the OR for the second time that day, it was past 9 p.m. And the corridor lights had shifted to the lower overnight register that made Summit Ridge look, briefly, like a different kind of place, quieter, stripped of its institutional pretense, just a building full of people trying to keep other people from dying. General Karras was in the corridor again. He wasn't in his full dress uniform this time. He was in a dark jacket, no stars visible, the kind of off-duty adjustment that senior officers made that somehow made them look more rather than less authoritative. He'd been sitting in one of the chairs along the wall and stood when the OR doors opened, and he looked at her with the same reading her face quality he'd had this morning. "He's going to keep the leg," she said. Kara sat back down. Just for a second, just the briefest drop of posture, before he collected himself. She'd seen that before too. The specific physical response of a body that had been holding tension for hours and suddenly didn't need to anymore, just for 1 second, before the discipline came back. "What happened?" he asked. She sat down in the adjacent chair and explained compartment syndrome in plain language because Karras was not a physician, but he was highly intelligent and he wanted to understand, not be managed. She told him what she'd caught, what it had required, how the second surgery had gone. She didn't editorialize about the authorization issue or Whitmore's role. She gave him the medical facts and let him hold them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You weren't supposed to be in that OR." "Technically, no. But you were." Someone who knew what was in the field needed to be there. He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen in a very different corridor, in a very different country, when she'd been 31 years old and hadn't slept in 4 days and had just come out of a surgical tent with blood on her arms to find a lieutenant colonel standing there wanting to know if his captain was going to make it. "You haven't changed," he said again, which was the second time he'd said it today, and she still didn't know exactly what he meant by it, only that it came from a place of genuine recognition and that it was not, in his register, a small thing to say. "I got older," she said. "We all did." He leaned back. "I talked to Hollis tonight. Hospital administration." "How did that go?" "About how you'd expect. A lot of assurances. A lot of language about process." He looked at the wall opposite. "I also talked to Jag. Quill filled me in on the certification flag." She nodded. "I want to be honest with you," Kara said. "I came to this hospital with a dying Marine and I found you running triage paperwork. That's on me as much as anything. Your record was... It was classified, Vivian. Your full record. The work you did in the program, the surgical record from the forward deployments, the citation from the Karas operation. None of that followed you into civilian life because it couldn't. That was the agreement you made when you transitioned out." She had made that agreement. She remembered the day she'd signed the paperwork, in a government building in Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon, a form that essentially said that the most significant decade of her professional life would not be visible to any civilian employer who checked her credentials through standard channels. She'd understood the reasoning. She'd signed because she'd believed in the program and because she'd been tired, genuinely tired, in the way that combat surgeons got tired after enough deployments, and she'd wanted to come home to something ordinary. She hadn't anticipated fully what ordinary would feel like when it looked at her and decided she wasn't enough. "I know," she said. "The JAG office is prepared to submit a formal declassification request for the relevant portions of your service record," Kara said. "The portions that establish your surgical credentials and your operational history. It won't cover everything. Some of it stays classified regardless. But enough to put the credentialing issue to rest permanently and to give any hospital administration a clear picture of who they actually have on their trauma floor." She held that for a moment. The declassification of her record was something she'd thought about and set aside because it required military cooperation. She hadn't known how to request from a civilian context, and because part of her had simply wanted to move forward without the weight of the past as a credential. She'd wanted to be good enough on her own terms, in the present. Today had demonstrated that the present had its own agenda. "What does the process look like?" she asked. "Quill is moving it as an urgent request given the active patient situation and the active attempt to remove you from surgical practice. It won't be instant, nothing is, but we're talking days, not weeks." He paused. "There's something else." She waited. "I made some calls this afternoon, after the hallway conversation with Whitmore, not to threaten anyone, just to understand the landscape." He turned to look at her directly. "The two surgeons who've been managing your assignment here, Whitmore and Nard, I asked Hollis for their case review records as part of my own due diligence around the care my soldier received. Hollis doesn't know he gave me anything useful, but the records show a pattern of complaint suppression, at least 3 nursing staff grievances in the last 2 years that were closed without investigation, and 2 patient communication failures that were internally resolved rather than reported to the state board." Vivian was quiet. "None of that is public yet," Kara said, "but it exists. And when the JAG office's documentation arrives and this facility has to confront the fact that they suspended a surgeon with your record over a paperwork gap that was weaponized to remove you from practice, the people asking questions are going to be looking at a much larger picture. That's not something I'm going to drive," she said. "I know you won't," he said. "You never did." He stood, jacket settling. "Get some sleep, Vivian. I mean it this time. You've operated twice today on 3 hours of sleep, and you're going to need to be present tomorrow for what's coming." She stood too. "I'm going to check Reeves one more time before I leave." "I assumed you would." He turned toward the elevator. "Still River," he said, not looking back. He said it the way someone says a name that means something to them, Not as a call sign, not as a military designation, just as a way of acknowledging a person whose quality he recognized and respected. Then the elevator opened and he stepped in and was gone. She went back to recovery. Dante Reeves was still sedated, still on the ventilator, and his color was better again. The mottling at the ankle was already fading as circulation reasserted itself through the released compartments. She checked the dressing, reviewed Vance's post-op notes, confirmed the monitoring schedule with the night nurse. She stood at the foot of his bed for a while. He was young, special operations young, which was its own specific category. The kind of young that had been put through processes that most people didn't survive, physically or otherwise, and had come out the other side harder and stranger and more capable than they'd started. She'd operated on a lot of soldiers like Dante Reeves. She'd never stopped being moved by the specific quality of their resilience, the way their bodies fought back even when everything was stacked against them. "You've got a good system," she told him quietly. "Use it." She left the hospital at 10:47 p.m. Her truck was still in the visitor lot, which struck her as slightly absurd. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but their presence was there in the way the sky sat above the tree line. That specific enormous darkness that Colorado mountain nights had, different from any other dark she'd known. She thought about Karis's word, "What's coming?" She thought about Quill's word, "Tomorrow." She thought about Harmon saying "watch your back" with the specific emphasis of someone who knew the terrain. She was not afraid of what was coming. She'd operated in worse positions than this, with worse resources, against worse opponents. What she felt, sitting in the visitor lot of Summit Ridge Medical Center at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, was something closer to clarity, the way the picture simplified when you stripped out the noise and looked at what was actually there. Whitmore and Nard had moved against her using the only tool available to them once it became clear she was not going to be quietly peripheral. They'd done it fast while she was in surgery, which meant the decision hadn't been improvised. It had been prepared, waiting for the moment when her profile became a problem. That told her they'd read her as a threat before today. That the Orvant bleed, the sepsis catch, the pattern of clinical accuracy that couldn't be easily buried, those had registered somewhere, even if they'd been officially ignored. She started the truck. She was halfway to her rental apartment, 3 miles from the hospital, when her phone lit up on the passenger seat. She left it. She'd check it when she stopped. She pulled into the apartment lot and picked it up. 2 messages. One from Quill. "Documentation package will be in your email by 0600. Significant. Read it before you go in." One from a number she didn't recognize, Colorado area code, timestamp 20 minutes ago. She opened the second message. "Dr. Cross, my name is Sable Orvant. You treated my husband, Gael, last week. I don't know if you remember. He's okay because of you. I just wanted you to know that I know what you did for him, and I'm not the only one. Some of us have been talking. If things are happening at that hospital that shouldn't be happening, and if there's anything we can do, I want you to have a way to reach me. You have my number." She read it twice. She set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked through the windshield at the apartment building's exterior light, the moths circling it, the ordinary dark of a Colorado night around it. There were people paying attention, more than she'd known about. And whatever Whitmore and Nard had built in that hospital, the culture of suppression, the buried complaints, the closed investigations, it had not left everyone in it unchanged. Some of them had been watching. Some of them had been waiting. She went inside, set her alarm for 5:30, and lay down without eating because she was too tired to eat, and her body knew the difference between hunger and exhaustion, and right now it was insisting on the latter. She was asleep in 4 minutes. At 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, her phone rang. She was awake before the second ring. Old reflex, the kind that combat deployments installed permanently and civilian life never fully removed. She picked up the phone. Quill's number. "I told you 0600, she said. "Something came in overnight," Quill said. He didn't sound like a man who'd slept. "The documentation package is in your email. Read it before you go in. But that's not why I'm calling." A pause. "We ran a background review on the credentialing flag, standard procedure when there's a JAG interest in a case. Cross, the flag on your file wasn't submitted by Whitmore's office." She sat up. "What?" "The user ID trace that the credentialing office ran, the one you requested yesterday. We had a colleague run the IDs through the hospital's HR system. The flag was entered from a terminal on the 4th floor. Administrator's office. Hollis. Whitmore didn't do it himself, Quill said. He went to the administrator, which means this wasn't a surgeon covering his position. This was institutional. Whitmore went to hospital leadership, and hospital leadership used administrative process to remove you from surgical practice. A brief pause. That's a different category of problem, Cross. That's potentially a coordinated action to suppress a physician's practice in direct response to military involvement. That is something the JAG office and the state medical board are going to be very interested in. She was standing now, moving toward the window without remembering deciding to stand. Outside, the pre-dawn sky over the mountains was beginning to differentiate from black into something dark blue and possible. How quickly can you move on this? She asked. The documentation package in your email contains a formal letter from General Karras's office to the hospital's governing board, a full credential verification from the Department of Defense, and a request for the state medical board to review the circumstances of the certification suspension. He paused again, and in the pause was something that she read before he said it, a kind of gathered weight, the feeling of a thing that was in motion and had reached a point where it could not be stopped. Cross, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. When you walk into Summit Ridge this morning, Whitmore and Hollis are not going to know yet that we have the terminal ID. They're not going to know the scope of what's been submitted. They're going to think they still have the upper hand. I understand, she said, and you need to walk in anyway. I was going to, she said. I know, Quill said. That's why I called early. She was in the shower 4 minutes later and in her truck 7 minutes after that, and the documentation package on her phone was 43 pages of her own history returned to her in formatted PDF, the surgical record she'd built over 15 years in places most physicians would never go, the citations she'd never been able to claim in a civilian job application, the operational assessments written by generals and colonels and senior medical officers who had watched her work under conditions that Summit Ridge Medical Center's trauma bay could not begin to approximate. She read it at a red light 2 blocks from the hospital, scrolling fast, seeing it laid out in formal government language that somehow made it feel like someone else's life and entirely like her own at the same time. General Karras's cover letter to the governing board was 3 paragraphs and contained no unnecessary words, and described her service record with the specific precision of a man who had been there for parts of it and had read the rest and understood exactly what he was looking at. The last paragraph read, "It is my formal position that the suspension of Dr. Cross's surgical authorization, in the context of her service record and the demonstrable circumstances of its execution, represents an action this office cannot regard as routine administrative process. I request that the governing board conduct an immediate and transparent review of the events of the past 5 days and provide this office with a formal accounting of the decisions made and the individuals responsible for them." She put her phone in her pocket and pulled into the hospital lot. Not the visitor lot this time. She parked in the staff section, in a space she technically wasn't credentialed to use yet, and walked to the main entrance with her badge and her canvas bag and the 43 pages of her own life on her phone. And when the doors opened ahead of her and the lobby's cold institutional air came out to meet her, she kept walking. She was halfway to the elevator when she heard Whitmore's voice from the corridor to her left. Not directed at her, he hadn't seen her yet. And then she heard something else. Another voice. Male, measured, with the particular quality of diction that came from legal training. She turned. Whitmore was standing outside the administrative corridor with Felix Nard beside him, and they were facing a man she hadn't seen before. Mid-40s, dark suit, a badge she couldn't read from this angle, but whose lanyard color she recognized because she'd seen that color before in government buildings in Virginia. It was the specific green of a state medical board observer. Whitmore's face, when he looked up and saw her, went through 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and then something she had not expected from a man who had spent 5 days projecting absolute institutional authority in every direction, something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like fear. The man in the dark suit turned to follow Whitmore's gaze. He looked at her badge. He looked at her face. He said, "Dr. Cross?" with the specific intonation of someone who had been told to expect a specific person and had just found them. "Yes," she said. He held out his hand. "Dr. Cross, I'm Gerald Fain, State Medical Board. I believe you've been expecting some contact from our office." He glanced at Whitmore, a glance that contained its own complete sentence. "We have a few things to discuss this morning, with you and—" The pause was exactly long enough to carry its weight. "With others." Whitmore said nothing. Nard said nothing. The corridor of Summit Ridge Medical Center held the silence of a room in which something was ending, even if no one had yet said what it was. Vivian looked at Fane. "I have some documentation you'll want to see," she said. "I believe we have some for you as well," he said. And somewhere above them, on the fourth floor where Hollis kept his administrator's office, with its credentialing terminal and its institutional authority, a phone began to ring and was not immediately answered. The conference room that Gerald Fane commandeered was on the second floor, 3 doors down from the credentialing office. And it had the particular quality of a room that had only ever been used for budget reviews and departmental scheduling meetings, suddenly being asked to hold something much heavier. Fane arranged his documents on the table with the methodical calm of someone who had done this before and knew that the room's discomfort was not his problem to manage. Vivian sat across from him. She'd sent her documentation package to his tablet before they'd walked in. Quill had set up the transfer link the night before, anticipating exactly this kind of morning. And Fane had read the cover page while they were still in the elevator, his expression doing the thing that faces did when they encountered information that reorganized their existing picture of a situation. "I've been briefed by Major Quill," Fane said, settling into his chair. "But I want to hear the sequence from you directly. Start from your first day." She told it without embellishment. She described the triage assignment, the Orvent catch, the sepsis identification, the corridor conversation she'd overheard, the Reeves surgery, the certification flag, the timestamp sequence from the credentialing office, and the second surgery the previous night. She kept her voice even and gave him facts rather than interpretations wherever possible, because interpretations were his job, and she'd learned a long time ago that the cleanest weapon in an institutional fight was a well-organized timeline. Fane took notes on a legal pad, longhand, which was either a personal preference or a deliberate choice to keep sensitive information off a system. When she finished, he set his pen down and looked at his notes for a moment before looking at her. "The terminal ID from the credentialing action," he said. "You have documentation of that?" She pulled up the HR system report Quill's colleague had run and sent it to his tablet. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled into a more deliberate configuration. "Administrator Hollis. That's the user ID trace, yes. And you have the timestamp showing the flag was entered while you were actively in surgery. While Dante Reeves's femoral artery was being repaired, yes." Fane looked at the timestamp for a moment longer than was strictly necessary to read it. Then he closed the file. "Dr. Cross, I want to be transparent with you about why the board moved as quickly as it did on this. We received General Karras's letter at 6:40 this morning. We also received, approximately 2 hours earlier, an anonymous complaint filed through our standard reporting portal." He paused. The complaint was about Summit Ridge Medical Center's trauma department specifically. It described a pattern of suppressed nursing grievances, 2 instances of patient communication failure that had been resolved internally rather than reported, and an allegation that a physician had been assigned deliberately below her competency level following a clinical catch that made senior staff look inadequate. Vivian held that. "Who filed it?" "Anonymous," he said. "We don't know, but the complaint was detailed enough and specific enough, with dates and case reference numbers, that it cleared our threshold for immediate review regardless of the Karras letter." He picked up his pen again. "Someone on the inside has been watching this for longer than 5 days." She thought of Harmon. She thought of Greta Osei's carefully neutral expression in the credentialing office. She thought of the recovery nurse Taft, who had caught the pulse change and called her immediately, rather than going through the chain that would have taken longer. She didn't say any of their names. "People notice things," she said. "They do," Fane said, and they apparently decided the moment had arrived to say so. He stood. "I'm going to need to speak with Dr. Whitmore and Administrator Hollis separately. I'd like you available in the building, but not in those meetings. Is that workable?" "I have a patient to check on," she said. "Then check on your patient." She left the conference room and took the stairs to recovery because she needed the physical transition, the movement between one thing and the next, the brief mechanical reality of her own legs on concrete steps. The fluorescent stairwell light was unflattering and cold, and she was glad for it. Dante Reeves was awake. Not fully. He was still in the shallow, effortful consciousness of a man coming out of heavy sedation with a significant post-operative load on his system. But his eyes were open and tracking, and when she appeared in his field of vision, they settled on her with the particular focus of a person who was working hard to hold on to the present moment. "Hey, Sergeant," she said. His mouth moved. His voice, when it came, was a rough, stripped-down version of what it probably sounded like normally. "Doc." "Yeah." "My leg." Not a question exactly. Something between a question and a statement. The kind of thing you said when you needed to know but weren't sure you were ready for the answer. "It's there," she said, "but both of them. Circulation is good. You had a complication last night that we addressed, and you're going to have a longer recovery than originally planned, but the function is intact." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something in them she recognized. Not relief exactly, but the particular recalibration that happened when a person who had prepared themselves for a very bad thing discovered the bad thing had not happened. "The general," he said. "He was here all day yesterday. He's been briefed." "He worries," Reeves said, and there was something in his voice that was almost fond, the specific, complicated warmth that special operations soldiers sometimes had for their commanders, that mixed genuine respect with the kind of frank, unsentimental appraisal you could only arrive at by having been in actual danger with someone. "He does," she agreed. "He hides it reasonably well." "Not that well," Reeves said, and closed his eyes again. She checked his chart, reviewed the overnight monitoring notes, confirmed the circulation assessments were scheduled for the next 3 intervals, and adjusted one element of his pain management protocol that was slightly underdosed for his body weight. Then she left him to rest. The nursing station was different this morning. She felt it before she could identify it. A quality of attention in the staff around the station that was not the ordinary morning shift attention of people organizing their workload. 2 nurses she didn't know by name were talking in low voices and stopped when she approached, then resumed after a half-second delay that was too short to mean avoidance but too deliberate to mean nothing. Taft was back, apparently having stayed or come in early, and he gave her a nod that was simple and direct and contained something like solidarity in it. Harmon was at the end of the station, reviewing a chart that she set down when she saw Vivian. "Fain's here," Vivian said. "I heard. He mentioned an anonymous complaint filed early this morning." Harmon looked at her for a moment. Her expression was exactly what it always was. Measured, professional, offering nothing it hadn't decided to offer. "Anonymous complaints are a function of the reporting system," she said. "The system exists so people can report things they need to report." Vivian nodded. "Right. That's all I have to say about that." "That's all I asked," Vivian said. Harmon picked her chart back up. "Reeves awake yet?" "Briefly. He's resting." "Good." She turned a page. "You should eat something. There's food in the break room. Someone brought in a thing. I don't know what it is, but it's not terrible." Vivian went to the break room and found a foil tray of something egg-based that a day shift nurse had apparently contributed, and she stood at the counter and ate a portion of it standing up, because sitting felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make, and the eggs were fine, slightly oversalted, entirely adequate, and she was hungrier than she'd realized. She was halfway through the coffee she poured after when Felix Nard walked into the break room. He stopped when he saw her. The stop was just slightly too long. Not a full hesitation, but enough to be visible. He was in his lab coat, badge clipped, carrying a tablet, which meant he'd been doing rounds or trying to look like he was doing rounds. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been awake since an earlier hour than was comfortable and was managing several things at once. He crossed to the coffee maker. He poured. He didn't speak for a moment, and she didn't speak, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. "The board observer is here," he said finally. "I know." "He's meeting with Roland right now." He said Whitmore's first name, which he apparently hadn't done in her presence before. And the shift was small, but it told her something about where he was situating himself this morning. A small, reflexive distance from the formal structure. "I know that too," she said. Nard turned with his coffee and looked at her. Not with hostility. Not with the performative tolerance he'd deployed their first afternoon. Something more complex than either. A man who had built his professional identity within a particular system and was now standing in a room with the person that system had attempted to remove and finding the geometry of that more uncomfortable than he'd anticipated. The Orvant catch, he said. I told Whitmore it was a good read, at the time. I know, she said. He said to document it as a team review outcome. She looked at him. I documented it that way, he said. He held his coffee with both hands and looked at it. I shouldn't have. It was not an apology exactly. It was also not nothing. She thought about what Harmon had said. Nard does what Whitmore tells him to do. And she thought about how much of what people did in institutional environments was less about malice and more about a slow, accumulated series of choices that each felt manageable in isolation until you looked at the whole shape of them. Nard wasn't a good person in the way that mattered most when the pressure was on. He also wasn't, she thought, someone who'd built his career on cruelty for its own sake. He was something more ordinary than that, and in some ways more frustrating. You should tell Fane that, she said, today, before he asks you. Nard looked up. If you go in there and give him the accurate sequence, it reads differently than if he extracts it, she said. That's not me giving you a favor. That's just true. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him processing that. The offer, and what it cost her, and what it might cost him, and whether it was real, which it was, even though it shouldn't have needed to be explained. Why? He said. Because the patient is alive, she said. And because what happens to you after this should be about what you actually did, not about what serves some other story. She rinsed her coffee cup and left him in the break room with that. The morning moved in the specific rhythm of a day in which the normal work was continuing alongside something that was not normal at all. Patients being assessed, charts updated, medications administered, the whole ordinary machinery of a hospital running on its regular track, while 3 floors and 2 conference rooms held something that was pulling at the foundations of the institutional structure everybody else was working inside. She covered 3 patients during the morning. A 68-year-old man admitted overnight with chest pain that was ruling out for cardiac and moving toward a musculoskeletal diagnosis. A 19-year-old who'd come in through the ED with a laceration requiring imaging review. A 44-year-old woman, post-op day 2 from an orthopedic procedure, whose recovery progress she assessed and whose chart she updated with specific observations about her respiratory pattern that she flagged for the attending. She did this work with the same attention she gave everything, because the work was the same whether the institution around her was stable or not, and because these 3 people deserved the same quality of assessment as anyone else, regardless of what was happening in the conference rooms. At 11:14, her phone buzzed with a message from Quill. Fane has requested Hollis's calendar and communication records for the past week. Hollis has lawyered up. That is, for your reference, very fast. She read the message once and put her phone back in her pocket. The speed of Hollis calling a lawyer told her something she'd already suspected, but now had confirmed. The credential flag hadn't been an improvised decision. It had been part of a conversation that had involved some degree of preparation, some advanced discussion about what would happen if Vivian became a problem that couldn't be managed through simple exclusion. People who had acted purely in the moment and then realized they'd overstepped did not call lawyers in less than 3 hours. People who knew they had exposure called lawyers immediately. Whitmore knew too, because Whitmore had gone to Hollis in the first place. The question she'd been turning over since Quill's early morning call was how much of the larger pattern, the suppressed grievances, the closed investigations, the 2 patient communication failures, Whitmore had actively constructed versus passively allowed. Both were bad. They were bad in different ways that would matter to Fane and to the board and to the eventual accounting. She didn't have enough information to distinguish between them, and that wasn't her job anyway. Her job was to keep doing what she was doing and be available when Fane needed her. At 12:40, Fane found her at the nursing station. I need 30 minutes, he said. They went back to the conference room. He had more notes on his legal pad now, several pages of them, and his jacket was off and there was a tension around his eyes that wasn't distress, but was the particular focus of someone who had been receiving information at a rate that required sustained management. I've spoken with Dr. Whitmore and separately with Administrator Hollis, he said. I'm not going to characterize those conversations in detail, but I want to share what I can. He set his pen down. Hollis has retained legal counsel and is declining to answer questions pending that counsel's review, which is his right, but the speed of that decision and the timing of the credential flag are going to be very difficult to separate in the board's analysis. And Whitmore? Fane looked at his notes. Dr. Whitmore provided a detailed account of his interactions with you over the past 5 days. He acknowledged that your assignment was below your demonstrated competency. He characterized it as a standard orientation protocol, which the record doesn't fully support given the duration and the nature of the cases you were assigned. He paused. He also acknowledged that he approached Administrator Hollis regarding your credentialing file, and that he had characterized the paperwork gap as an urgent concern requiring immediate action. Did he say why? She asked. He said he had concerns about liability exposure if a physician operating under incomplete verification were to have a negative patient outcome. Fain looked at her steadily. Given that the patient outcome was not negative, and that the verification gap was a documentation issue rather than a substantive credential issue, the board's reading of that rationale is likely to be skeptical. Vivian said nothing. Dr. Nard came to me voluntarily at 11 this morning, Fain continued. He provided an account of the Orvant case documentation, specifically that he had followed Dr. Whitmore's direction in attributing the clinical catch to a team review outcome rather than to your individual assessment. He paused again. He also provided 3 other instances from the past 18 months in which he was aware of nursing staff complaints being routed through Whitmore before reaching HR, and in which the outcomes differed from what the nursing staff had been told to expect. Nard had gone in, voluntarily, before being asked. She thought about his face in the break room, the specific quality of discomfort that came from a man who had finally looked at the accumulated shape of his choices and found it worse than he'd been telling himself it was. What happens now? She said. The board is opening a formal investigative proceeding into Summit Ridge Medical Center's trauma department, Fain said. That proceeding will take time, weeks, possibly months, for a full resolution. But there are immediate actions. He looked at her directly. Your surgical authorization is reinstated as of this morning. The suspension is invalidated on the basis that it was procedurally improper and executed under circumstances that constitute potential interference with medical practice. You are cleared to operate. She let herself feel that for exactly 1 second. The governing board of this hospital is being convened for an emergency session this afternoon, Fain continued. General Karras's letter will be formally entered into that session. The board will be asked to review the credentialing action, the pattern of suppressed complaints, and the specific case documentation provided by Dr. Nard. I won't tell you what outcome to expect from that session, because I genuinely don't know. Governing boards are their own creature, but I will tell you that the information they're going to be looking at today is not information that supports the current departmental leadership structure. Whitmore, she said, and Hollis, if Hollis is ultimately found to have acted outside his administrative authority. He picked up his pen. There's one more thing. He looked at a specific page in his notes. We received 2 additional contacts this morning through the board's reporting portal. Both named. Both current or former Summit Ridge nursing staff. Both describing specific incidents. He looked up. You weren't the first person this happened to, Dr. Cross. You were just the first one with a lieutenant general in her corner. The room held that for a moment. She thought about the women and men in that hallway over the past 2 years who had filed complaints that went nowhere. She thought about what it cost to file something and have it closed without explanation, and then make the daily calculation about whether to come back to a place that had told you your concern didn't matter, and keep coming back because people needed care and someone had to provide it. She thought about that very specific kind of institutional courage that didn't have a name and didn't get recognized and kept the machinery running anyway. The people who filed those complaints, she said, will the board see them? Yes, they're part of the formal record. Make sure they know that, she said. Not just in writing, someone should tell them directly that what they submitted mattered and that it's going to be part of what the board reviews. Fain looked at her. That's outside my standard process. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he wrote something on his legal pad. I'll make a call this afternoon, he said. She thanked him and stood and went back to her work. The governing board session was called for 3 p.m. She wasn't in it. She wasn't supposed to be. She was in recovery checking Reeves's afternoon vitals. Improved, steadily improved. The distal pulse now strong and consistent in both locations she'd been monitoring. When Harmon found her at 4:17, board session ended, Harmon said. And? Whitmore's been suspended pending investigation. Effective immediately. He's not on the floor as of now. Hollis is on administrative leave. She paused. They appointed an interim department head. Dr. Ewan, from the second-floor surgical team. She's solid. Vivian nodded. That's not the thing I came to tell you, Harmon said. She waited. Whitmore requested a meeting with you, Harmon said, before he left the building. He's in the third-floor family consultation room. He asked the board liaison to pass the request to you directly. She paused. You don't have to go. I know, Vivian said. She went. The family consultation room was the kind of room that hospitals built for delivering bad news. Warm lighting, padded chairs, a box of tissues on the side table that had never quite lost its institutional feel despite the attempt at softness. Whitmore was sitting in one of the chairs rather than standing, which surprised her. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man without a performance to maintain. He was 61, she estimated. Silver-haired, still dressed well, still carrying the physical authority of a man who'd been significant in professional rooms for 30 years. But the room had gone out of him, the specific quality of energy that had filled every space he'd occupied on the trauma floor, and without it he looked like someone she didn't quite recognize. She sat down. He didn't speak immediately. She didn't fill the silence. I didn't know your record, he said finally. His voice was tired. I want you to understand that. I didn't know what you'd done or where you'd done it. When you came in with a canvas bag and a provisional badge, I made an assessment based on what I could see, and I was wrong. He paused. That's not an excuse, it's a fact. I know you didn't know the record, she said. The record was classified. Which I didn't check. Which you didn't check, she agreed. He looked at his hands. The Orvant documentation, directing Felix to attribute it to a team review. I told myself it was a workflow decision, that individual attribution on internal cases wasn't our protocol. He stopped. That's not what it was. No, she said. It wasn't. The credential flag. He looked at her. His eyes were steady, but without any of the managing quality they'd had before. I told myself Hollis was simply correcting a paperwork gap, that it was legitimate administrative process. He paused. I knew what it was. I let myself believe the other thing because it was more comfortable. She looked at him and thought about what she wanted to say and chose carefully, not because she was protecting him, but because she wanted to mean what she said. You're a competent surgeon, she said. You're probably a good department head when you're not threatened. What you did to me was wrong, and what you allowed to happen to the people who filed complaints before me was wrong, and the board is going to take a while to untangle how much of that was active and how much was passive, and the answer is probably some of each. She paused. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're a monster because I don't think that's true, and because it wouldn't be useful even if it were. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was close to gratitude, which she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure he deserved, but which she recognized as a genuine human thing and not a performance. What will you do? He asked. My job, she said. She left him in the consultation room and took the elevator back to the third floor. The afternoon shift was transitioning, the nursing station in the specific organized bustle of handoff, and she reviewed 2 charts and signed off on one adjustment before she checked her phone again. A message from Sable Orvant sent 43 minutes ago. I heard something is happening at the hospital. I don't know the details. Are you okay? She typed back. I'm okay. Your husband still is too. Thank you for reaching out. A message from Quill. Board decision logged with JAG office. Formal record from this point forward. Cross. You should know the governing board's resolution included a formal note of commendation for the care provided to Sergeant Reeves. Your name is on it. She looked at that for a moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on her patient one more time before the end of the day. Reeves was awake again, more fully this time, enough to track her with clear eyes and speak with something closer to his actual voice. He asked her about the second surgery. She told him in plain terms what had happened and what she'd done and what it meant for his recovery timeline. He listened without interrupting, which was the quality she'd noticed in special operations soldiers before, a capacity for hearing difficult information without flinching, not because they weren't affected by it, but because they'd trained themselves to receive information first and react to it after. Longer than I wanted, he said, about the recovery. Probably, she said, but you'll get there. Will you be here? He asked. When I'm doing PT, will you still be here? She thought about everything that had been set in motion today. The investigation that was going to run for weeks, The restructuring of a department. The people whose complaints were now in a formal record. The 43 pages on her phone that had been classified for 3 years and were now moving through an official declassification process. The simple, extraordinary fact that she was still authorized to operate. "Yeah," she said, "I'll be here." He nodded and closed his eyes. She was at the nursing station signing her last chart of the day when interim department head Dr. Ewan appeared beside her. Mid-50s, precise, with the kind of face that processed information quickly and didn't waste expressions on things that didn't require them. She'd spoken to Ewan twice in passing over the past 5 days and formed an assessment that Harmon's description of solid was accurate. "Dr. Cross," Ewan said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly given the circumstances." "Dr. Ewan, I've reviewed the cases you managed this week, all of them." Ewan held her gaze. "I also read the board summary, including the commendation." A pause. "I want to ask you directly. The trauma department is going to need significant rebuilding over the next several months, in terms of culture, protocol review, and staffing assessment." She paused again. "I'd like your involvement in that process, formally, with appropriate authorization. Your perspective on what the department needs is going to be more useful than almost anyone else's right now." Vivian looked at her. "I'm still a provisional staff member. Provisional status is a function of credentialing completion," Ewan said, "which is going to be resolved very quickly, given the documentation that came through today. I've already spoken with the credentialing office." She paused once more. "I'm asking whether you're willing to be part of this." Vivian was about to answer when her pager went off. The sound cut through the nursing station and she looked at the number without moving because she recognized the extension. The admitting desk, trauma level, the specific code for inbound critical. Then the overhead came through. Multiple vehicle accident, Route 7, 4 inbound, ETA 7 minutes, trauma bay activation. She looked at Ewan. "I'm a trauma surgeon," she said. "That's my bay." She was moving before Ewan could respond, and as she moved, she heard Ewan behind her saying something to the station that included the words "Cross is primary on this," and the nursing staff around the station moved in response, pulling equipment and calling confirmations and doing what trauma nursing staffs did when the machinery engaged and the real work began. But it was in the corridor on her way to the bay, 30 seconds before she reached the doors, that her phone buzzed one more time with a message from Quill, and the content of it stopped her mid-step with a quality of stillness that she hadn't felt since the moment Karis had said her name in the hallway 24 hours ago. The message read, "Cross. Urgent. Board declassification moved faster than expected. Full surgical record now available to hospital administration. But JAG just flagged something in the records review that we didn't anticipate. There's a complaint in the board's system, filed this morning, named, from a Dr. R. Whitmore, filed against you, alleging that you exceeded your suspended authorization during the second Reeves surgery with the intent to undermine his surgical authority. He filed it before the board session, before he knew what the board was going to decide. The complaint is in the formal record, and the board has to address it regardless of today's outcome. Cross. This doesn't change what happened today, but it doesn't go away either. Call me." The trauma bay doors were 30 feet ahead of her. 4 critically injured people were 7 minutes out. And somewhere in the formal administrative record of Summit Ridge Medical Center, in a filing that had been submitted while Whitmore was still calculating that he might survive the day with his position intact, was a complaint designed to put a shadow over the one person who had made it impossible for him to do so. She put the phone in her pocket. She pushed through the trauma bay doors. The 4 patients from Route 7 came in the way mass casualty arrivals always came in. Not as a clean sequence, but as a simultaneous collision of needs, each one demanding triage in real time while the others waited in the specific desperate patience of bodies that couldn't afford to wait. Vivian moved through the bay with the nursing staff reorganizing around her, Ewan's authorization already running through the floor's communication channel. And she did what she had always done when the volume exceeded the available calm. She narrowed her attention to what was directly in front of her and trusted her training to handle the rest. 2 of the 4 were stable enough for immediate transfer to surgical prep. The third had a pneumothorax she identified in under 90 seconds and addressed with a chest decompression that bought him time. The 4th was a 17-year-old girl with a traumatic head injury whose pupils were unequal and whose GCS had dropped twice in transit, and Vivian called neurosurgery before the gurney was fully inside the bay and stayed with her until the neurosurgical resident arrived, and she'd transferred care with a verbal summary, precise enough that the resident didn't need to ask a single clarifying question. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. When it was over, she washed her hands at the bay sink and stood for a moment with the water running over her wrists and let her pulse come down. Harmon appeared in the bay entrance. All four are placed. The head injury? Neuro has her. They're optimistic. Harmon leaned against the doorframe. You should call Quill back. I know. The Whitmore complaint is going to come up tomorrow whether you call tonight or not. I know that too. Harmon looked at her steadily. Call him. Go home. Come back tomorrow. She paused. In that order. Vivian dried her hands and called Quill from the parking lot, standing next to her truck in the dark with the mountain cold coming down and the hospital lit up behind her like a paper lantern. Quill picked up on the second ring. He'd been waiting. You read the message. I read it. Tell me what it actually means. Whitmore filed the complaint at 9:47 this morning, Quill said. Before the board session, before Nard went to feign, before any of today's decisions landed. He was still operating under the assumption that he controlled the institutional outcome. A pause. The complaint alleges you performed a surgical procedure, the fasciotomy, without authorization, under the guise of consultative presence, with the intent to exceed your suspended scope and undermine his authority as the supervising surgeon. The fasciotomy was Whitmore's procedure, she said. He held the instruments. I provided guidance on the field anatomy from the original repair. I know, and the OR record supports that. Vance's anesthesia notes support it. Price's scrub record supports it. Another pause. But the complaint is in the formal record, and the board has 30 days to respond to named complaints regardless of the filer's current status. Whitmore being suspended doesn't make it disappear. What does disappear it? A formal board review that finds the complaint without merit, Quill said, which, given the OR documentation, is the likely outcome. But it takes time, and it means you're going to walk into that hospital tomorrow with an open complaint attached to your name. She looked up at the hospital's lit windows. Somewhere on the recovery floor, Dante Reeves was asleep. Somewhere in the building's administrative record was a filing made by a man who had spent his last hours of institutional power trying to attach one more weight to her before he lost the ability to do so. It was a very human thing to do, which didn't make it less of what it was. Quill, she said. What does the OR record show, specifically, about who made the incisions? A brief silence. Whitmore. Every logged instrument contact is Whitmore. And my role? Consultative verbal guidance, which is within the scope of the exception he authorized when he brought you in. Then the complaint is inaccurate on its face, she said. It's not a gray area. It's wrong. Yes, Quill said. That's the JAG office's read too, which is why I think the board review is going to be faster than 30 days. But I wanted you to know tonight so you weren't walking in tomorrow without the full picture. She exhaled into the cold air, a white cloud, and then gone. Thank you. Get some sleep, he said. Again. She drove home with the radio off and the windows cracked enough to let the cold in, which kept her alert and also felt, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, like the right amount of discomfort for the end of a day like this one. Not punishment, just reality. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and the road was mostly empty, and she drove at exactly the speed limit because she was tired and because she had no desire to add anything to the evening's inventory. She slept without difficulty. That was something she'd learned in the field and kept. The ability to sleep when sleep was available, without waiting for resolution, without needing the situation to be settled before she could let go of it. The situation was what it was. She would meet it in the morning. The morning was a Tuesday. She arrived at 7, parked in the staff section, badged through the main entrance. Her badge still reading provisional, but the system accepting it without the hesitation it had shown yesterday, and went directly to the credentialing office before rounds. Greta Osei was already at her desk. Dr. Cross, she said, and her expression was the most readable it had been in any of their interactions. Not warm exactly, but human, the expression of a person who had watched something unfold in a building they worked in and had formed a view about it. I wanted to follow up on the re-verification timeline, Vivian said, given the documentation submitted yesterday. It's done, Greta said. The DoD credential verification cleared last night. Both surgical certifications are fully verified in our system as of 6 this morning. She pulled a document from a folder beside her keyboard and slid it across the desk. Full authorization, no restrictions. I also want you to have this. A second document, thinner. It's the formal record correction. The suspension notation has been removed from your file. The board ordered it expunged, not just reversed. It's as if it was never entered. Vivian looked at the second document. Expunged. Not annotated, not corrected with a note explaining the circumstances. Removed. The board had made a specific choice about what kind of record they were willing to let stand. Thank you, she said. I want to say something, Greta said. She looked at her desk and then up. I processed that flag. I knew when I processed it that the timing was wrong. I followed the procedure because the procedure said to follow the authorization chain, and the authorization chain said the flag was valid. She paused. I should have slowed it down, asked more questions. I had the ability to do that, and I didn't use it. Vivian looked at her. You gave me the timestamp records when I asked, she said. You could have made that harder than you did. That's a low bar, Greta said. Most things start at a low bar, Vivian said, and then you raise it. She took her documents and went to work. The board's formal review of Whitmore's complaint against her was scheduled for the following Thursday, 8 days out. Fain had communicated that timeline through Quill, along with the information that the OR documentation had been reviewed by 2 independent board members, and that the preliminary assessment was that the complaint lacked substantive basis. 8 days. She could work with 8 days. She did work. She worked every one of those days with the same attention she'd brought to the first shift, because the patients didn't stop arriving and the work didn't pause for institutional proceedings, and she had not come to Ashford, Colorado to wait for the right moment to do what she was capable of doing. She'd come to work. So she worked. On day 3, Sergeant Dante Reeves was moved from recovery to a standard room, which was a milestone that meant his systems had stabilized enough to reduce monitoring intensity and that the recovery arc was progressing on the better end of her projections. She visited him that afternoon. He was sitting up, which was new. There was color in his face that hadn't been there before. You look less dead, she said. High praise, he said. From me, yes. She reviewed his chart standing at the foot of the bed. PT starts tomorrow. It's going to be uncomfortable. Good uncomfortable or bad uncomfortable? Is there a difference? He thought about it. Yeah, he said. There is. Good uncomfortable, she said. The kind that means things are working. He nodded. The general's coming Thursday. I heard. He wanted me to tell you he'll come by your office, if you want. She looked up from the chart. I don't have an office. Reeves almost smiled. He said you would say that. He said to tell you that you will by Thursday. She put the chart down and left before the smile could reach her face while he was watching. On day 5, 2 things happened. The first was that the State Medical Board issued a preliminary finding on the pattern of suppressed grievances at Summit Ridge, identifying 11 separate complaints over a 26-month period that had been altered, delayed, or closed without proper investigation. The finding named Whitmore as the primary actor in 9 of the 11 cases and noted that Hollis had provided administrative facilitation in at least 4 of them. The document was not the final disciplinary action that would come through a separate process, but it was a formal public record that the board had found the pattern credible and substantiated. The second thing was that Nard submitted his resignation. She heard about the resignation from Harmon, who heard about it from the charge nurse on Whitmore's former service. And when she heard it, she stood at the nursing station for a moment without moving. Nard was 38 years old. He was, she believed, a technically capable surgeon who had made the choice available to him in his environment and discovered too late what that choice looked like from the outside. His resignation was probably the right decision in the sense that his position in the department was structurally untenable after what he'd told Fain. It was also a loss. The department needed surgeons. She didn't know how to feel about that and decided she didn't have to resolve it. On day 6, Ewan stopped her in the corridor after morning rounds with a document that she handed over without preamble. It was a formal offer. Chief of Trauma Surgery, Summit Ridge Medical Center. Full authorization, department leadership, involvement in the board-mandated protocol review that was going to run in parallel with the state investigation. The salary was 30% above her current provisional rate. which she noted and set aside as a secondary consideration. The title was not what she'd come looking for. She hadn't come looking for any of it. "Take a day," Ewan said, "but not more than that. The department needs to know who's running it." "The department knows who's running it," Vivian said. "You are." "Interim," Ewan said, "and we both know it. I'm a good surgeon and a decent administrator, and I am not a trauma physician. The department needs someone who is." She looked at Vivian with the direct, unadorned attention that Vivian had come to appreciate in her. "You've been running this floor functionally since the second day you were here. The offer is the structure that should exist around what you're already doing." Vivian took the document and took her day. She thought about it the way she thought about most significant decisions. Not by listing pros and cons, but by sitting with the picture of what each path looked like in 6 months, in 2 years, in 5. She thought about the department as it existed right now. 2 senior physicians gone, a protocol review mandated by the state, a nursing staff that had spent 2 years watching complaints disappear and was now, cautiously, testing whether the new structure was different. She thought about what it would take to rebuild trust in a place like that. Not through speech or symbolic gesture, but through the daily work of showing up and doing what you said you would do. She thought about the broken chair at the triage desk. She thought about Greta Osei saying I should have slowed it down and choosing to say it anyway. She thought about Taft catching the pulse change and calling her name instead of the longer chain. She thought about what Reeves had asked her in the recovery room. "Will you still be here?" And what she'd answered and what it would mean if the answer changed. She called Ewan the next morning and said yes. Thursday arrived cold and clear, the kind of Colorado morning where the sky was an impossible blue and the mountains looked close enough to touch, and the air had a quality that reminded her of the first morning she'd driven into Ashford, which felt like it had happened in a different chapter of a life she was still in the middle of. The board review of Whitmore's complaint against her was scheduled for 10 a.m. She was there at 9:50 with her documentation and quill on the phone as backup. The review took 47 minutes. The board's 3-member panel read the OR record, reviewed Vance's notes and Price's instrument log, heard her account of the fasciotomy, and asked 6 questions, 4 of which were procedural and 2 of which were substantive. At the end of it, the panel chair, a woman named Dr. Olorunfemi, who had the air of someone who had reviewed a very large number of complaints and developed precise instruments for distinguishing real ones from constructed ones, looked at the documentation one final time and said the finding was unanimous. The complaint filed by Dr. Roland Whitmore against Dr. Vivian Cross was found to be without basis in fact or in the operative record. It was formally dismissed and would not appear in any professional record or reference related to Dr. Cross. Furthermore, the panel noted that the complaint had been filed under circumstances, specifically by a physician under active investigation in the final hours of his institutional authority, targeting a physician whose actions had been instrumental in exposing the conditions under which he'd operated, that raised questions about its intent. That notation would be attached to Whitmore's own file. Vivian thanked the panel and left the room. In the corridor outside, she stood for a moment against the wall with her documents in her hand. The hallway was ordinary. Overhead lights, floor wax, a cart being pushed somewhere in the distance, the sound of a hospital continuing to be a hospital regardless of what happened in its conference rooms. She'd stood in a lot of corridors like this one over the past 9 days, and they'd each held something different, and now this one held the specific quality of something finished. Not perfectly finished. There was still the state investigation. There were still 11 complaint cases that needed formal resolution. There was still a department that needed rebuilding and a staff that needed to learn, slowly, that the new structure would hold when tested. There was still Dante Reeves's rehabilitation, which was going to take months. None of it was done. But this specific thing, the complaint, the shadow Whitmore had tried to attach to her name on his way out the door, was done. Dismissed, documented, buried in his record, and removed from hers. She wasn't going to celebrate that. She was going to note it and move. General Karras arrived at 2:15. He came to the trauma floor rather than to the administrative offices, which told her he'd gotten directions from Reeves or the aide or someone who knew where she'd actually be. He found her at the nursing station reviewing a post-op chart, and she looked up and he was in his dress uniform again, which meant something official was happening, and she straightened accordingly. Harmon appeared from somewhere, and then with great deliberateness moved to the far end of the station, which was as close as Harmon was going to get to giving them privacy while still being present, and Vivian understood and appreciated the geometry of it. Sergeant Reeves tells me his PT went well this morning, Karis said. Better than expected, she said. His baseline fitness is carrying him through. He also tells me you called him less dead. I said he looked less dead. It was a compliment. Karis almost smiled again. She was getting better at reading the shape of it. I've been informed of the board's decision this morning. Word travels fast. It does when JAG is involved. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a document, official, government formatted, sealed with a stamp she recognized from the paperwork she'd signed in Virginia 3 years ago. This is the formal declassification notice for the relevant portions of your service record. The full surgical history, the operational citations, the Karis commendation. It's yours now. To use, to include in any professional documentation, to hold. He held it out. It was always yours. The classification was a protection mechanism for an ongoing program, not a judgment about value. I want you to know I understand the difference, even if the outcome was the same. She took the document. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, or maybe that was just what it felt like to hold a decade returned to you in paper form. Thank you, she said. I also want to formally, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and on behalf of myself, express gratitude for what you did for Sergeant Reeves, he said. His voice had shifted into the register she'd heard him use for formal statements, but underneath the formality was the same thing that had been there when he'd said her name in the hallway 9 days ago. Recognition, genuine and unhurried, the kind that came from actually knowing what something had cost. Twice. Under conditions that most physicians would not have navigated the way you did. She looked at him. He's worth it, she said. They all are, he said. That's why you went to the places you went. She stood with that for a moment. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said to her about the decade that had just been returned to her in a sealed document. I'm staying, she said, not in response to any question he'd asked, just as a fact that seemed worth stating. I've taken the department position. I'm going to be here. He nodded. I hoped you would. A pause. Summit Ridge is lucky, whether it knows it yet or not. It's starting to figure it out, she said. He offered his hand, formal and deliberate, and she shook it, formal and deliberate, and that was the transaction. The acknowledgement between two people who had been through something together that most people in this building would never fully understand, and who were now standing in an ordinary corridor returning to their respective ordinary, extraordinary lives. After he left, she went to see Reeves one more time. He was in the middle of an exercise sequence with the physical therapist, working through range of motion with the focused grunt and breathe rhythm of a man relearning what his body could do. She stood in the doorway and watched for a moment without interrupting. He looked up and saw her and nodded, one of those nods that contained a full sentence, and she nodded back with the same economy, and that was enough. She walked the long way back to the nursing station, through the east corridor, past the triage desk where she had sat in the broken chair on her first afternoon and reviewed patient charts that nobody else had found time for. The chair was still broken. She had submitted a maintenance request for it on day 3, and the request was apparently somewhere in a queue. The desk was occupied by a third-year resident named Bloom, who was running triage overflow with the slightly overwhelmed focus of someone being asked to do more than they'd been prepared for, which was, Vivian had come to believe, exactly the right amount of challenge for someone at that stage. She stopped at the desk. "How's the board?" she asked. Bloom looked up. 1 possible fracture, 2 lacerations, 1 I'm not sure about yet. The one you're not sure about. Show me. Bloom pulled up the chart and Vivian read it and asked 2 questions and suggested an imaging order, and watched Bloom absorb the reasoning rather than just the conclusion, which was what made a good teacher as opposed to someone who simply told you what to do. She left Bloom to it and moved on. At 5:30, she was the last attending on the floor from the day shift, which happened sometimes, and which she didn't mind. She finished her charting, sent 3 follow-up orders through the system, and put on her coat at 6:10. The floor was quiet. In the way early evening made hospital floors quiet. Not empty, never empty, but lower in register. The specific sound of a place running on its own momentum rather than under full pressure. She stopped at the end of the corridor, at the window she passed every day, where the late winter light was coming in at an angle over the mountains, and the parking lot below was already going dark. She stood there for a moment with her coat half on and looked at the mountains, which were doing what Colorado mountains did in that light, turning colors that had no names she'd ever found adequate for them, blue and purple, and something older than either. She thought about what Karis had said, "They all are. That's why you went to the places you went." He was right. She'd spent 15 years in places that would break most people, not because she didn't feel what they felt, but because she'd known, in some foundational part of herself, that the work was the point, that the work had to be done, and that she was someone who could do it, and that those two facts together constituted a kind of purpose that didn't need a grander name. What she understood now, standing at this window in this building where someone had pointed her to a broken chair and told her she wasn't useful for anything more, was that the purpose didn't change depending on whether the institution recognized it. It existed independently of the institutional record. It had existed all the years the record was classified. It had existed the morning she'd walked in with a canvas bag and been handed a provisional badge and sent to Triage Overflow. It had been doing its work the whole time, quiet and continuous, the way rivers moved under ice. She had not needed to prove it. It had proved itself. She had not needed to fight for it. The work had spoken, clearly and without argument, and the people who had tried to silence it had found that the thing they were trying to silence was louder than anything they could arrange against it. That wasn't justice delivered from outside. It was the natural consequence of something real meeting something constructed, and the constructed thing failing to hold. It always failed eventually. Not always in time, not always in the ways that satisfied, not always without cost to the people it had been used against. And she knew, and did not minimize, that the people who had filed complaints before her had paid costs she hadn't had to pay. That her outcome had been partly a function of a general's loyalty and a classified record and resources that most people didn't have access to. The world was not fair in its distribution of those resources. That was true, and she held it. What she also held was the simpler truth beneath it, that what you were didn't disappear because someone refused to see it. That the people who had paid attention, Harmon, Taft, Greta Osi, Reeves in his recovery room asking if she'd still be here, Sable Orvant texting from across the city, had been paying attention all along, without the classified record, without the general, simply because they were people who noticed real things and refused to stop noticing them. She finished putting her coat on. She picked up her canvas bag. She walked through the corridor of Summit Ridge Medical Center toward the exit, and as she passed the nursing station, Harmon looked up from her chart and said nothing, just gave her the same small, deliberate nod she'd given on that first afternoon over the Orvant case, the nod that was a complete sentence. Vivian nodded back. She pushed through the doors into the cold Colorado evening and walked to her truck. The staff lot this time. The space she'd taken on the morning everything changed and had taken every morning since. And she sat for a moment before starting the engine, not because she needed to process anything, but because it was a good evening and the mountains were doing their thing with the light. And she had learned, in all the years and all the places, to notice the moments when something difficult had resolved into something solid, and to sit with them briefly before moving on. She started the truck. She had rounds in the morning. There was a patient who needed her, and a department that was learning to become what it should have been, and a chair at a triage desk that still needed fixing, and a resident named Bloom who was being asked to do more than they were ready for and was doing it anyway, which was exactly how people became who they were supposed to be. She drove home through the dark, and the mountains held their place behind her, permanent and indifferent and beautiful, the way the things that mattered always were, not waiting for acknowledgement, not diminished by its absence, simply there, doing what they were, outlasting everything that tried to pretend they weren't.